The massive crystal dome of Nexus Prime hummed with quiet tension as Ambassador Zexthera stepped forward to address the Galactic Council. Her blue-scaled hands trembled slightly as she activated the central display, showing star maps and incident reports from across the galaxy. The assembled representatives from 43 different worlds sat in silence, their various forms creating an odd collection of shapes and colors in the curved chamber. "Honored council members," Zexthera began, her voice carrying the formal tone required for such serious matters. "We face a situation unlike any in our recorded history. 3 solar cycles ago, we made first contact with a species from a small blue planet they call Earth. What began as routine diplomatic procedures has become something far more complex." The display shifted to show images of creatures that looked similar to several known species, but with subtle differences. They walked upright like the Altarians, had smooth skin like the Vegans, but their eyes held something that made even the bravest council members feel uneasy. There was intensity there, a fire that seemed to burn without end. Captain Jake Morrison had no idea that his image was being shown to hundreds of alien dignitaries at that very moment. He stood on the bridge of the Endeavor, watching the green and gold planet of Kethmara grow larger on the main screen. This would be their third first contact mission in as many months, and Jake felt the same mix of excitement and responsibility he always experienced when meeting a new species. "Captain, we're receiving a transmission from the planet's surface," reported Lieutenant Ben Parker from the communications station. "They're using the standard galactic greeting protocols." Jake nodded and straightened his uniform. "Put them on." "Screen, Ben." The view screen flickered and showed the elongated face of High Curator Velmos, leader of the Kethran Collective. His silver eyes blinked slowly as he spoke in the translated common tongue. "Welcome, humans of Earth. We have prepared a meeting place for our discussions." "Thank you, High Curator," Jake replied with a warm smile. "We look forward to learning about your people and sharing information about ours." What Jake didn't know was that Velmos had already received detailed reports about previous human encounters from other species. The reports painted a disturbing picture of beings who refused to accept defeat, who found solutions where none should exist, and who maintained their spirits even in the darkest situations. Dr. Lisa Park sat in her laboratory aboard the Endeavor, reviewing her notes from their last 2 first contact missions. As the ship's xenobiologist, she was responsible for documenting how humans interacted with alien species and how those interactions affected both sides. Her computer held detailed files on everything from communication patterns to emotional responses during negotiations. "Computer, display comparison chart of human versus alien problem-solving approaches during the Centauri incident," Lisa said aloud. The screen showed 2 columns of data. On the left, the Centaurian approach to their mining disaster. Careful analysis, committee discussions, resource allocation studies, and a final recommendation to abandon the operation. On the right, the human approach. Immediate action, creative use of available materials, round-the-clock work shifts, and a successful rescue of all trapped miners within 48 hours. Lisa frowned as she studied the data. The pattern was clear across all their encounters. Humans acted first and analyzed later, while most alien species did the opposite. This difference had led to successful outcomes in every case, but she wondered how the aliens really felt about human methods. Back on Nexus Prime, Ambassador Zexthera continued her presentation to the increasingly worried council. The humans claim to come in peace, and their actions support this claim. However, their behavioral patterns suggest capabilities that could pose a significant threat to galactic stability. She activated a new section of the display, showing video footage from the Centauri mining incident. The council watched in stunned silence as humans worked without rest, sharing food and water equally, and maintaining positive attitudes even when the situation seemed hopeless. When the rescue was complete, the humans had not only saved the trapped Centaurian miners but had also improved the mine's safety systems and increased its productivity. This footage was taken during what the Centaurians classified as an impossible rescue scenario, Zexthera explained. Note how the humans refuse to accept the concept of impossibility. They do not seem to understand that some problems cannot be solved. A ripple of unease passed through the assembled delegates. The concept of unsolvable problems was fundamental to most galactic civilizations. It was the basis of their philosophy, their resource management, and their approach to expansion. Species that had learned to accept limitations had survived and thrived. Species that had not accepted limitations had either destroyed themselves or been destroyed by others. Counselor Thuvak of the Altarian hegemony raised one of his forearms to speak. Ambassador Zexthera, are you suggesting that humans are naturally aggressive? No, Counselor, she replied quickly. Our intelligence reports indicate that humans are actually quite peaceful by galactic standards. They form strong social bonds, show remarkable loyalty to their groups, and demonstrate genuine concern for the welfare of other species. However, they possess something we have never encountered before. She paused, letting the tension build in the chamber before continuing. They appear to be psychologically incapable of giving up. When faced with obstacles, they do not retreat or find alternative paths. They break through the obstacles. When presented with impossible situations, they make them possible. When told something cannot be done, they prove it can be done. The silence in the chamber was complete. Every species represented in the council had built their civilization on the understanding that some things were impossible. Some resources were limited, and some problems had no solutions. This understanding had prevented wars, guided exploration, and maintained peace for thousands of years. Dr. Quinteler, the council's chief xenobiologist, stood slowly. His tall, thin frame cast strange shadows in the chamber's lighting. If I may, Ambassador Zexthera, I believe we need to consider the evolutionary implications of this human trait. Please proceed, Dr. Quinteler. Most of our species evolved as prey animals, he began, his voice carrying the weight of scientific authority. We developed intelligence as a survival mechanism, learning to avoid danger and conserve resources. Humans appear to have evolved differently. They show characteristics of persistence hunters, predators who succeeded not through strength or speed, but through their refusal to stop pursuing their goals. The implications of this statement hit the council like a physical blow. If humans were natural predators, what did that mean for the rest of the galaxy? Meanwhile, Jake Morrison completed his successful negotiation with the Kethran Collective, establishing trade agreements and cultural exchange programs that would benefit both species. As the Endeavour prepared to leave orbit, he had no idea that his diplomatic success had just been added to a growing file that would soon change the fate of the galaxy. Dr. Lisa Park saved her latest report and transmitted it to Earth Command. Unaware that her detailed observations were being intercepted and analyzed by alien intelligence services, her innocent scientific curiosity was providing ammunition for those who viewed humanity as a potential threat. The Galactic Council session ended with a unanimous vote to classify Earth and its human inhabitants as a Class X hazard zone. Official advisory would be transmitted to all member worlds within hours. Species demonstrates unprecedented adaptability and persistence. Approach with extreme caution. Do not engage in extended contact without council approval. As the delegates filed out of the chamber, each returned to their home worlds carrying the same troubling question. If humans refused to accept that anything was impossible, what would they do when they discovered the true size and complexity of the galaxy around them? The luxury cruise ship Stellar Dream had been the pride of the Galactic Tourism Bureau for 15 years. Its gleaming hull carried passengers from dozens of worlds on scenic tours through the most beautiful star systems in known space. Captain, Mordix had commanded the vessel for 8 years without a single serious incident, which made the current crisis all the more shocking. Red warning lights flashed across the bridge as the ship's chief engineer, a 4-armed Regelian named Tekver, delivered the devastating news. "Captain, the main drive core is completely destroyed. We have maybe 20 minutes before total power failure." Captain Mordix looked at the star charts with growing horror. They were 3 days from the nearest inhabited system, drifting toward a planet that barely registered on their sensors. "What about the emergency beacon?" "Transmitting, but the nearest rescue ships are at least 4 days away," Tekver replied, his voice heavy with despair. The captain activated the ship-wide communication system. "All passengers, please report to emergency stations immediately. We are experiencing critical system failure and will be making an emergency landing." Among the 847 passengers aboard the Stellar Dream, 23 were humans returning from a cultural exchange program on Vega Prime. Most of the passengers were standard galactic tourists, wealthy beings who expected luxury and comfort during their travels. The humans were different from the start. Bill Hayes, a 60-year-old retired military engineer from Texas, was playing cards with 3 Altarian businessmen when the emergency announcement echoed through the recreation deck. While his alien companions immediately began discussing the proper procedures for filing insurance claims and contacting their families, Bill was already moving toward the nearest emergency station. "Where are you going?" asked one of the Altarians. The announcement said to report to emergency stations, not to actually go there immediately. Bill stopped and looked back with confusion. "The ship is about to crash. We need to get ready." "But the crew will handle everything," another Altarian replied. "That is what they are trained for." Bill shook his head and continued toward the emergency station, where he found Dr. Amy Foster, a marine biologist from California, already examining the emergency supplies. She was a small woman with brown hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail of their situation. "How bad is it?" Bill asked. Amy looked up from the supply crates she was inventorying. "Bad. We're looking at a crash landing on an unknown planet with minimal emergency supplies. The good news is that the planet has breathable atmosphere and liquid water. The bad news is that it's not on any of the safe travel lists." As the Stellar Dream entered the atmosphere of Kepler 442b, the human passengers were already organized and ready. Bill had divided them into teams based on their skills and experience. Amy was leading the science team to assess the planet's safety, while a former construction worker named Steve Miller was organizing the other humans to prepare for impact. The landing was violent and chaotic. The ship's hull cracked in 3 places, and 2 of the main passenger compartments were flooded with toxic gases from the planet's atmosphere. Emergency systems failed across the ship, leaving most areas without power or life support. In the hours following the crash, the differences between human and alien responses became starkly apparent. The alien passengers gathered in the safest remaining section of the ship and began calculating their remaining resources. They formed committees to discuss rationing procedures and establish communication protocols for when rescue arrived. Humans, meanwhile, were already outside the ship. Bill Hayes stood on the rocky surface of Kepler 442b, watching the purple sky darken toward what he hoped would be night. The air was breathable but thin, and the gravity was slightly stronger than Earth normal. Strange sounds echoed from the alien forest that surrounded the crash site, and 2 of the planet's 3 moons were visible in the sky. "Amy, what do you think?" he called to Dr. Foster, who was collecting soil samples 50 meters away. "The soil is rich in minerals but low in organic content," she replied, not looking up from her work. "The plant life appears to be carbon-based and possibly edible. But I need to run more tests. The water in that stream over there tested clean, but we should boil it to be safe." Steve Miller emerged from the forest carrying an armload of fallen branches. Found dead wood for fire and what looks like some kind of fruit growing on the trees. Also found tracks from something big, but they look old. Within 6 hours of the crash, the humans had established a temporary camp outside the ship. They had a fire burning, clean water boiling, and shelter frameworks built from salvaged materials. Bill had organized work teams that operated in shifts, ensuring that someone was always working on improving their situation. The alien passengers watched this activity with growing amazement and concern. Counselor Vex-High of the Andromedan Republic approached Bill as he was designing a water collection system using pieces of the ship's hull. "Human haze," Vex-High said formally. "We appreciate your efforts, but the rescue ships will arrive within days. This work is unnecessary." Bill looked up from his sketches, genuinely confused. What if they don't arrive within days? What if something goes wrong? What if the weather changes and we need better shelter? These are unlikely scenarios. Vex-High replied. "We have calculated the probability of rescue failure at less than 3%. "That's still 3% too high for me," Bill said, returning to his work. "Besides, staying busy keeps morale up." By the end of the first week, the contrast between the human and alien approaches had become impossible to ignore. The aliens had maintained their initial emergency shelter and were carefully rationing their supplies according to precise calculations. They held daily meetings to discuss their situation and update their rescue probability estimates. The humans had built a small village. Amy Foster had identified 17 different species of edible plants and had begun cultivating the most nutritious ones in a makeshift garden. Steve Miller had constructed a workshop where he was manufacturing tools and equipment from ship salvage. Bill Hayes had designed and built a water purification system that could supply clean drinking water for the entire group of survivors. Most remarkably, the humans were happy. They sang songs while they worked, told stories around their fire at night, and maintained an optimistic attitude that baffled their alien fellow passengers. When supplies ran low, they shared without question. When someone was injured, they cared for each other without expecting anything in return. Dr. Kellenoth, a Centaurian psychologist who had been studying the human behavior, approached Amy as she was teaching a group of young alien passengers how to identify safe plants to eat. "Dr. Foster," he said carefully, "may I ask you a question about human psychology?" Amy looked up from the plant samples she was showing to a curious vegan child. "Sure, what would you like to know? Why are you not afraid?" Kellenoth asked. "We are stranded on an unknown planet with dangerous wildlife, limited supplies, and uncertain rescue prospects. By all logical measures, this situation should produce anxiety and despair. Yet you and your fellow humans seem almost content." Amy thought for a moment before answering. "I guess we're not really stranded," she said finally. "We're just somewhere we didn't plan to be. As long as we can find food, water, and shelter, we can survive here. And if we can survive, we can figure out how to thrive. But what if rescue never comes?" Kellenoth pressed. Amy shrugged. "Then we build a new life here. Humans have been doing that for thousands of years. Every time our ancestors found themselves in a new place, they adapted and made it home." When the rescue ships finally arrived, 3 weeks after the crash, they found a remarkable scene. The alien passengers were waiting in the ship's emergency shelter, weak but alive. The humans were outside working on expanding their settlement, which now included permanent structures, cultivated fields, and a workshop that was producing tools and equipment for trade with the aliens. Captain Zorthek of the rescue vessel filed a report that would soon reach the highest levels of galactic command. His description of the human settlement, complete with video documentation, showed beings who had not just survived an impossible situation, but had turned it into an opportunity for growth and learning. The report noted that the humans had worked 18-hour days without complaint, had shared their resources freely with the alien passengers, and had maintained positive morale throughout the crisis. Most disturbing to the galactic authorities was the final observation. When asked if they wanted to return to their home worlds, several humans had expressed genuine sadness about leaving their new settlement behind. As news of the Kepler 442b incident spread throughout the galaxy, it joined the growing file of human activities that were causing concern among alien civilizations. The beings from Earth were not conquering worlds or destroying enemies. They were doing something far more unsettling. They were making the impossible look easy, and they seemed to enjoy doing it. The Zephyrian War had been raging for 12 long years across 17 star systems, and the Galactic Defense Force was losing badly. General Caxworth stood in the command center on Fortress Station Alpha, staring at the tactical display that showed nothing but red markers, indicating lost worlds and destroyed fleets. The enemy was unlike anything the galaxy had faced before. The Zephyrians were an insectoid species that operated as a single mind across billions of individual bodies. They learned from every battle, adapted to every strategy, and seemed to predict every move the Defense Force made. Traditional military doctrine was useless against an enemy that could process information faster than any computer and coordinate attacks across multiple worlds simultaneously. "Sir, we've lost contact with the 7th Fleet," reported Colonel Thymer, his blue skin pale with exhaustion. "That's the 3rd Fleet this month." General Caxworth closed his 4 eyes and tried to think of options they hadn't already tried. The Centaurian Defense Corps had contributed their best strategic minds. The Altarian hegemony had shared their most advanced weapons technology. The Vegan Republic had offered their finest diplomatic negotiators. Nothing had worked. "Sir," another officer called from the communication station. "We're receiving a priority message from Galactic Command. They're sending military advisors." The general's eyes opened with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "From which world?" "Earth, sir." A heavy silence fell over the command center. Everyone had heard the stories about humans by now. The species that turned disasters into victories, that refused to accept defeat, that somehow made impossible situations possible. But war was different from rescue missions or survival scenarios. War required discipline, strategy, and careful planning. 3 days later, Commander Rick Stone stepped off the transport ship onto Fortress Station Alpha. He was a tall man with gray hair and calm eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. Behind him came a small team of human military advisors, each carrying simple equipment bags, instead of the elaborate gear cases that other species typically brought to war zones. General Caxworth met them in the station's main docking bay. "Commander Stone, welcome to Alpha Station. I must admit, I am curious to see what humans can contribute to this conflict." Rick shook the general's hand with a firm grip. "Thank you for having us, General. We're here to learn about your enemy and see if we can help." The briefing room was filled with holographic displays showing 12 years of battle data. General Caxworth walked the human team through every major engagement, every strategic attempt, every failure that had brought them to this desperate point. "The Zephyrians operate as a collective consciousness," the general explained. "They process information instantly across their entire population. When we develop a new tactic, they adapt to counter it within hours. They learn faster than we can change." Lieutenant Colonel Maria Gonzalez studied the battle footage with intense concentration. She was a small woman with dark hair who had spent her career studying military history. "General, what's the longest any single battle has lasted?" 17 hours, Caxworth replied. "Usually, once they understand our strategy, they overwhelm our forces quickly." Maria nodded and made notes on her tablet. "And they always attack in the same formations?" "Yes, they have perfected efficient attack patterns that maximize their advantages." "Perfect," Maria said quietly, which confused the alien officers in the room. "Captain Dave Wilson, The team's intelligence specialist raised his hand. "General, do the Zephyrians ever retreat?" "Never," Caxvorth said firmly. "They fight until victory or complete destruction. It is one of their most terrifying characteristics." Dave smiled, which made the alien officers even more confused. "That's actually really good news." Over the next week, the human advisors did something that surprised everyone on the station. Instead of studying advanced weapons or reviewing strategic databases, they spent their time talking to regular soldiers. Rick Stone sat in mess halls listening to stories from enlisted personnel. Maria Gonzalez interviewed pilots who had survived. Encounters with Zephyrian fighters. Dave Wilson played card games with maintenance crews who had worked on damaged ships. "What are they doing?" General Caxvorth asked his aide after watching Commander Stone spend 3 hours talking to a janitor about the layout of captured Zephyrian facilities. "I believe they are gathering intelligence, sir," the aide replied uncertainly. The breakthrough came during a routine patrol mission. Sergeant Pete Collins, a human who had volunteered to accompany an alien reconnaissance unit, was captured when their ship was damaged by Zephyrian fighters. According to standard procedure, the aliens expected him to be killed or used for information extraction. Instead, Pete did something completely unexpected. He started talking to his captors. The Zephyrians had never encountered a prisoner who seemed genuinely interested in learning about their culture. Pete asked questions about their history, their social structure, and their motivations for the war. He shared stories about human conflicts and how they had been resolved through negotiation and compromise. The individual Zephyrians were confused by this approach. Their collective mind had no framework for processing a prisoner who treated them as individuals rather than as parts of a hostile force. For the first time in their species' history, some Zephyrians began to experience thoughts that were not shared with the collective. When Pete was finally rescued 2 days later, he brought back information that changed everything. "They're not as unified as we thought," Pete reported to the assembled command staff. "The collective mind works because every individual agrees with the group decision. But when you treat them as individuals, some of them start to think independently." Maria Gonzalez leaned forward with excitement. "What happened when they started thinking independently?" "They got confused," Pete said. "The collective started receiving conflicting information. Some wanted to continue the interrogation. Others wanted to follow standard procedures. They couldn't reach consensus, so they just stopped functioning efficiently." Rick Stone stood up and walked to the tactical display. "General Caxvorth, we need to completely change our approach to this war. What do you propose?" the general asked. "We stopped trying to outfight them," Rick said. "Instead, we're going to confuse them." The new strategy was unlike anything in galactic military history. Instead of large coordinated attacks, human advisors trained small mixed units to operate independently using unpredictable tactics. They used different approaches in every engagement, sometimes retreating when victory was possible, sometimes attacking when defeat seemed certain. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Gonzalez developed training programs based on human historical warfare. She taught alien soldiers about guerrilla tactics, psychological warfare, and the art of making the enemy guess what would happen next. The goal was not to defeat the Zephyrians through superior force, but to overload their collective decision-making process with too much contradictory information. The results were immediate and dramatic. Zephyrian forces that had been unstoppable for 12 years suddenly began making mistakes. They would prepare for frontal attacks and face ambushes from behind. They would expect retreats and encounter suicidal charges. They would anticipate advanced technology and be defeated by simple improvised weapons. Captain Dave Wilson led a mission that captured a Zephyrian communication node, not to destroy it, but to feed it false information about human military capabilities. The psychological warfare campaign he developed introduced concepts that the collective mind couldn't process the possibility of defeat, the value of individual thought, and the idea that some problems had no perfect solutions. Within 6 months, cracks began to appear in the Zephyrian collective. Individual units started questioning orders. Some groups began operating independently from the main force. A few even attempted to open communication channels with human units, seeking to understand these strange beings who fought without predictable patterns. The war ended not with a great battle, but with a simple message transmitted across all Zephyrian communication networks. It was a recording of Pete Collins speaking directly to individual Zephyrians, acknowledging their existence as thinking beings separate from their collective and offering them the choice to decide their own future. The collective consciousness, faced with the unprecedented concept of individual choice, simply collapsed. Millions of Zephyrians suddenly found themselves thinking their own thoughts for the first time in their species' history. Most were terrified by the experience, but others discovered something they had never known existed: personal freedom. Peace negotiations were conducted not with a single collective representative, but with dozens of different Zephyrian groups, each speaking for themselves. The galaxy watched in amazement as the species that had been their greatest threat transformed into a collection of independent communities, seeking to learn about individuality and choice. As news of the war's end spread throughout the galaxy, military leaders from every major civilization began requesting human advisors. But others quietly began strengthening their defenses, not against the Zephyrians, but against the possibility that humans might someday decide their own worlds needed to be liberated. The mining colony on Proxima 7 had been operating peacefully for 8 months when the dispute began. The human mining team, led by Supervisor Frank Davis, had been extracting rare minerals from the planet's northern continent while maintaining good relations with the nearby Altarian observation post. Everything changed the day they discovered the ancient ruins. Dr. Tony Martinez was the first to see them. As the team's cultural specialist and archaeologist, he had been surveying the area around the mining site when his equipment detected unusual energy signatures beneath the surface. What he found when he started digging made him call for an immediate halt to all mining operations. "Frank, you need to see this," Tony called over the communication system. "We've got structures down here that are definitely not natural." Frank Davis stopped the mining equipment and hurried to Tony's location. The archaeologist had uncovered the corner of what appeared to be a massive stone building covered in symbols that neither human nor Altarian databases could identify. "How old do you think it is?" Frank asked, kneeling beside the exposed stonework. Tony ran his scanner over the symbols and frowned at the readings. "The mineral dating suggests this is at least 50,000 years old, maybe older." "Frank, this could be progenitor technology." The progenitors were the legendary first civilization of the galaxy, a species that had vanished millions of years ago, but whose advanced technology was still considered the most sophisticated ever created. Any discovery of progenitor artifacts was supposed to be reported immediately to the Galactic Council for Study and Protection. Frank nodded and activated his communication system. "I'll contact Earth Command and let them know what we found." "Tony, document everything but don't disturb anything else until we get instructions." Unknown to the humans, their communications were being monitored by the Altarian Empire. Within hours of Tony's discovery, Altarian ships were heading toward Proxima 7 with orders to claim the planet as a sacred archaeological site. Ambassador Helen Cross received the emergency briefing while she was traveling to a routine trade negotiation on Vega Station. The message from Earth Command was brief but urgent. Human miners had discovered progenitor ruins. The Altarians were claiming the planet belonged to them, and diplomatic intervention was needed immediately to prevent an armed conflict. Helen was the experienced diplomat who had spent 15 years working with alien governments. She understood the delicate balance of galactic politics and the Importance of maintaining good relationships with other species. However, she also understood that humans had a legal right to mine on Proxima 7 under the treaty signed 3 years earlier. Agent Sullivan, Helen said to her security chief, "What's our current status with Altarian relations?" Agent Kate. Sullivan was a former intelligence operative who served as both bodyguard and advisor to the ambassador. She was known for her ability to assess situations quickly and find solutions that others might miss. "Relations have been tense since the Zephyrian War ended," Kate replied. "The Altarians are worried about human influence spreading through their sector. They see us as unpredictable and potentially dangerous." "Great," Helen said dryly. "So, they're already nervous about us, and now we've found ancient artifacts on a planet they want to claim. This should be interesting." When they arrived at Proxima 7, the situation was even worse than expected. 3 Altarian warships were in orbit around the planet, and the mining team had been ordered to cease all operations immediately. The Altarian commander, Admiral Keshthul, was demanding that all humans leave the planet within 24 hours. "Ambassador Cross," Admiral Keshthul said during their first communication, "this planet contains sacred artifacts of the Ancient Ones. Your people have no right to disturb such holy ground." Helen kept her voice calm and diplomatic. "Admiral, I understand your concern for archaeological preservation. However, human mining rights on this planet were established by treaty 3 years ago. We're willing to work together to protect any historical sites while continuing our lawful operations. The treaty is void," the Admiral replied firmly. "This planet now belongs to the Altarian Empire as a protected religious site." The negotiations continued for 3 days without progress. The Altarians refused to compromise, and the humans refused to abandon their legal mining operation. Tension increased when Admiral Keshthul ordered his troops to surround the human mining facility and took the entire team hostage. "This is an act of war," Frank Davis told Helen during a secret communication. "They've got armed soldiers pointing weapons at my people." Helen felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Frank, I need you and your team to stay safe and follow their orders for now. We're going to handle this diplomatically." Kate Sullivan had been quietly studying the situation while Helen conducted official negotiations. As a former intelligence operative, she understood that sometimes the best way to solve a problem was to become part of it. "Helen," Kate said privately, "I have an idea, but you're not going to like it. Let me hear it." "I'm going to surrender myself as an additional hostage," Kate said. "Once I'm inside their security perimeter, I can organize the mining team and start working on our captors from the inside." Helen stared at her security chief. "Kate, that's completely insane. You'll be walking into enemy hands with no backup and no way to escape. Trust me," Kate said with a slight smile. "I've dealt with hostage situations before. Sometimes the best way to control a situation is to let the other side think they're in control." Against her better judgment, Helen agreed to the plan. Kate Sullivan walked up to the Altarian guards surrounding the mining facility and formally surrendered herself as a prisoner. What happened next became legendary in diplomatic circles throughout the galaxy. Kate didn't try to escape or fight her captors. Instead, she began talking to them. She asked about their families, their homes, their reasons for serving in the military. She shared stories about human culture and listened carefully to their concerns about human expansion into their territory. The mining facility, she organized the human workers into teams that began a campaign of passive resistance. They didn't fight or argue with their guards. Instead, they started treating the Altarians as guests rather than captors. Frank Davis began teaching Altarian soldiers how human mining equipment worked. The miners shared their food with the guards and invited them to join their daily exercise routines. Dr. Tony Martinez started giving archaeology lessons to curious Altarian officers. explaining human methods for preserving and studying ancient artifacts. The Altarian guards had been trained to deal with prisoners who would try to escape, fight back, or negotiate for better treatment. They had no training for prisoners who seemed genuinely interested in making friends. Within a week, several Altarian soldiers were requesting transfers rather than continue guard duty. Others began questioning their orders to point weapons at beings who shared food and asked about their children. The rigid military discipline that held the operation together started to break down as individual soldiers began thinking of the humans as people rather than enemies. Meanwhile, Dr. Tony Martinez made a discovery that changed everything. Using advanced human archaeological techniques, he was able to determine the true age of the progenitor ruins. The artifacts were not 50,000 years old as initially thought. They were over 200,000 years old, which meant they predated Altarian civilization by nearly 100,000 years. "Helen," Tony reported during a secret communication, "these ruins are older than any known Altarian settlement. Their claim that this is ancient Altarian holy ground doesn't hold up to scientific analysis." Ambassador Helen Cross used this information to completely reverse the diplomatic situation. During a formal meeting with Admiral Keshthul, she presented the archaeological evidence and pointed out that Altarian claims to the planet were based on incorrect historical assumptions. "Admiral," Helen said calmly, "our archaeologist has determined that these ruins predate your civilization by thousands of generations. While we respect your religious beliefs, you cannot claim ownership of artifacts that existed long before your people reached the stars." The Admiral was forced to admit that Altarian historical records contain no mention of Proxima 7 before human colonization began. Faced with scientific evidence that contradicted their claims, the Altarian Empire had no choice but to withdraw their forces and acknowledge human rights to the planet. The hostage situation ended not with a rescue operation or military intervention, but with Altarian guards voluntarily releasing their prisoners and apologizing for the misunderstanding. Several soldiers even asked if they could stay on the planet to help with the archaeological excavation. News of the Proxima 7 incident spread quickly through diplomatic channels across the galaxy. The ease with which humans had turned a hostage crisis into a cultural exchange program left many alien species wondering if diplomatic contact with Earth was really safe. The Galactic Council's intelligence services added another file to their growing collection of human incidents. This time, the report noted that humans seemed capable of weaponizing friendship itself, turning enemies into allies through nothing more than genuine interest in their well-being. As Admiral Keshthul's ships departed Proxima 7, he transmitted a Persa Lucy Chen had always believed that truth was more powerful than any weapon. As an investigative journalist, working for the Independent Galactic News Network, she spent her days uncovering stories that governments and corporations preferred to keep hidden. Her latest investigation, however, would shake the foundation of galactic civilization itself. It started with a simple question from her editor at the news station. "Lucy, we're getting reports that several alien worlds have quietly increased their military spending in the past year. Can you look into why?" Lucy began her research expecting to find evidence of a new threat or resource dispute. What she discovered was far more disturbing. Military budgets were increasing specifically for defensive purposes, and the threat they were preparing for was humanity itself. Her breakthrough came when she received an anonymous message through encrypted channels. The sender identified himself only as a friend of truth and provided her with coordinates for a secure meeting. Location on the neutral station of Harmony Point. The being who met her in a private conference room was unlike any species she had encountered before. Tall and thin with pale blue skin and large eyes that seemed to hold great sadness, he introduced himself as Counselor Thai Bricks of the Reformed Vegan Republic. "Miss Chun," he said quietly, "I have information that your people deserve to know. but sharing it will likely end my political career and possibly my life. Lucy activated her recording device and leaned forward. What kind of information? The Galactic Council has been maintaining classified files on human activities for the past 4 years, Thybrix explained. These files contain detailed analyses of every human interaction with alien species, psychological profiles of human behavior patterns, and recommendations for limiting human expansion throughout the galaxy. Lucy felt her heart racing. Are you saying the Council is spying on humans? I am saying the Council considers humans to be the greatest threat to galactic stability since the Destroyer Wars 3,000 years ago, Thybrix replied. But not for the reasons you might think. Over the next 3 hours, Thybrix shared documents that revealed the true scope of the galactic conspiracy against humanity. The files contained reports from every major human contact, from Captain Jake Morrison's first diplomatic missions to the recent incident on Proxima 7. Each report concluded with the same recommendation. Human expansion must be contained before they destabilize the existing galactic order. The Council fears humans because you refuse to accept limitations, Thybrix explained. Every other species in the galaxy learned long ago that some problems cannot be solved. Some resources are finite, and some goals are impossible to achieve. This acceptance of limitation is what has kept peace in the galaxy for millennia. Lucy studied the documents with growing anger. So they're afraid of us because we don't give up? They are afraid because human psychology threatens the foundation of galactic civilization, Thybrix said. If other species learn from humans that limitations can be overcome, that impossible problems can be solved, that resources can be expanded rather than simply conserved, the entire structure of galactic society could collapse. The most damaging document was a psychological analysis written by Dr. Quinteler, the Council's chief xenobiologist. His research showed that most galactic species had evolved from prey animals, developing intelligence as a defense mechanism against predators. Their civilizations were built on concepts of hiding, conserving, and avoiding conflict. Humans, the report concluded, had evolved differently. They were persistence hunters who had developed intelligence not to hide from threats, but to overcome them. This fundamental difference in evolutionary psychology made humans incompatible with the rest of galactic civilization. According to this analysis, Lucy said, reading from the document, humans are naturally inclined to expand, explore, and challenge existing systems. The report recommends that human expansion be limited to prevent them from influencing other species. That is correct, Thybrix confirmed. The Council has been working to isolate humans diplomatically while studying ways to modify human behavior to make them more compatible with galactic norms. Lucy spent the next 2 months verifying the information and gathering additional evidence. She interviewed sources throughout the galaxy, many of whom confirmed that their governments had received warnings about human psychological influence. The evidence was overwhelming. The galaxy's major powers were actively working to limit human expansion and influence. When Lucy published her series of articles titled, "The Human Files: How the Galaxy Learned to Fear Hope," the reaction was immediate and explosive. The articles revealed not only the existence of the classified files, but also the specific recommendations for containing human expansion. The revelation caused a crisis that split the galaxy into 2 camps. Species like the Centaurians and reformed vegans who had worked closely with humans demanded an end to the surveillance and isolation policies. Others, led by the Altarian hegemony, formed a defensive coalition aimed at preventing human influence from spreading to their worlds. On Earth, the reaction was one of hurt and confusion rather than anger. Admiral Jake Morrison, now commander of Earth's Space Forces, addressed the planet in a broadcast that was transmitted throughout the galaxy. "We came to the stars hoping to make friends," Morrison said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "We shared our knowledge, helped in crises, and tried to be good neighbors. If our desire to solve problems and overcome challenges makes us dangerous, then perhaps we need to reconsider our place in this galaxy. The Galactic Council called an emergency session to address the crisis. For the first time in galactic history, a human was invited to address the full assembly. Admiral Morrison was chosen to speak for humanity, and his speech would determine the future relationship between Earth and the rest of the galaxy. The council chamber on Nexus Prime had never held such tension. Representatives from hundreds of worlds watched as Morrison walked to the central platform. His simple Earth uniform, a stark contrast to the elaborate robes and ceremonial armor worn by other delegates. "Honored council members," Morrison began, his voice calm but firm. "I stand before you today not as a conqueror or a threat, but as a representative of a species that refuses to believe anything is impossible." He paused, looking around the chamber, at the assembled aliens who had spent years studying and fearing his people. "You are right to call us dangerous," Morrison continued. "We are dangerous to despair, dangerous to hopelessness, and dangerous to the idea that suffering must be accepted simply because it has always existed. We are dangerous to those who would tell others that their dreams are too big, their goals too ambitious, or their problems too complex to solve." The chamber was completely silent as Morrison delivered the core of his message. "But we are only dangerous to those who choose to see hope as a threat rather than a gift. We came to the stars not to conquer, but to explore. Not to dominate, but to discover. Not to take, but to share. If that makes us dangerous, then we accept that judgment." Morrison's final words would be remembered throughout galactic history. "We will continue to reach for the stars, to help those in need, and to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. We invite any species that shares these values to join us. For those who prefer the safety of accepted limitations, we respect your choice. But we will not let fear of the possible prevent us from pursuing the impossible." The vote on humanity's status in the galactic community was closer than expected. The motion to formally contain human expansion failed by only 12 votes out of nearly 300 cast. However, the debate had fundamentally changed the galaxy's perspective on limitation and possibility. In the months following Morrison's speech, several species began adopting human approaches to problem solving. Young aliens started questioning their society's acceptance of traditional limitations. Universities across the galaxy began offering courses in human-style creative thinking. The final scene of the crisis played out on a newly established joint colony called New Harmony, where humans and aliens worked together to build a settlement that incorporated the best ideas from multiple civilizations. Children from dozens of species played together while their parents collaborated on projects that previous generations would have considered impossible. Dr. Tony Martinez, now serving as the colony's chief archaeologist, watched a group of young Altarians and humans excavating progenitor ruins together. The children were using techniques that combined human intuition with Altarian precision, achieving results that neither species could have accomplished alone. "Maybe being dangerous isn't always a bad thing," he said to his assistant, a young Centaurian named Velinara. "What do you mean?" she asked. Tony gestured toward the children working together. "Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is prove that the impossible is actually possible. It changes everything." The galaxy had learned to fear humanity's refusal to accept defeat, their infectious optimism, and their dangerous belief that any problem could be solved. But in the end, perhaps the most dangerous thing about humans was their ability to make others believe in possibilities they had.